The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding Florence as Niccolò Machiavelli walked the worn stone paths of his estate in Sant'Andrea. The year was 1515, and the former secretary of the Florentine Republic found himself in the peculiar position of having lost all political power yet gained unprecedented clarity about the nature of human influence and mental fortitude. As he contemplated the machinations that had led to his exile, a profound understanding crystallized in his mind about the essential principles required to maintain intellectual independence in a world perpetually seeking to bend minds to its will. The events that brought him to this revelation began 3 years earlier, when the Medici family had returned to power and stripped him of his position. Initially consumed by bitterness and desperate attempts to regain favor, Machiavelli had experienced firsthand how external pressures could cloud judgment and compromise principles. It was during this period of enforced reflection that he began to formulate what he would later consider his most crucial insights, not about governing others, but about governing one's own mind. Part 1: The Foundation of Mental Sovereignty. The first principle emerged from Machiavelli's observation of how the human mind, like a fortress, required specific architectural defenses against siege. He had witnessed countless intelligent individuals fall prey to manipulation not through lack of knowledge, but through absence of systematic mental discipline. The foundation of mental sovereignty, he realized, rested upon 3 interconnected pillars that must be constructed with the same precision a military engineer would employ in designing fortifications. The cornerstone of this foundation lay in what he termed the cultivation of skeptical inquiry. Unlike mere cynicism, which rejected all information indiscriminately, skeptical inquiry demanded rigorous examination of every claim, regardless of its source or apparent reasonableness. Machiavelli recalled his years in the Chancery, where he had observed how even the most experienced diplomats could be deceived when they failed to question information that aligned with their pre-existing beliefs. He remembered distinctly a negotiation with Cesare Borgia, where the Duke had presented a proposal that seemed overwhelmingly favorable to Florence. The council members, eager to secure what appeared to be an advantageous agreement, had been ready to accept immediately. Only Machiavelli's insistence on examining the proposal's underlying motivations revealed Borgia's true intention: to use Florence's resources to strengthen his own position while leaving the Republic vulnerable to future manipulation. This experience taught him that the mind's natural tendency to accept pleasant information without scrutiny represented its greatest vulnerability. The antidote required developing what he called productive paranoia, a systematic suspicion that served not to paralyze decision-making but to ensure that all decisions rested upon thoroughly examined foundations. This meant questioning not only the content of information but its timing, source, presentation method, and intended effect upon the recipient. The second pillar involved understanding and neutralizing emotional manipulation. Machiavelli had observed that skilled manipulators rarely attacked the rational mind directly. Instead, they targeted emotions: fear, hope, anger, pride, or desire, knowing that strong feelings could override logical analysis. The defense against such tactics required developing what he termed emotional archaeology, the ability to excavate one's emotional responses and examine their origins before allowing them to influence decisions. During his own fall from power, Machiavelli had experienced how hope could cloud judgment as powerfully as fear. His desperate desire to return to political relevance had made him susceptible to flattery and false promises from those who claimed they could restore his position. Only when he began systematically analyzing his emotional responses did he recognize how his longing for restoration had compromised his usually sharp political instincts. The practice of emotional archaeology involved creating temporal distance between feeling and action. When confronted with information that provoked strong emotional responses, the disciplined mind would pause to ask, "Why am I feeling this way? What specific elements in this information are triggering this emotional state? How might this emotional response serve someone else's interests? Who benefits if I act based on this feeling without further analysis?" The third pillar required mastery of what Machiavelli called perspective multiplication. He had noticed that individuals became most vulnerable to influence when they viewed situations from a single vantage point. Skilled manipulators exploited this limitation by presenting information in ways that made their preferred perspective appear to be the only reasonable one. The defense involved deliberately cultivating the ability to examine any situation from multiple viewpoints, especially those that seemed initially uncomfortable or contrary to one's inclinations. This practice had served him well during complex diplomatic negotiations, where understanding the motivations and constraints of all parties often revealed solutions that remained invisible from any single perspective. He would systematically ask himself, how would this situation appear to my enemy? What would someone with completely different values conclude about these circumstances? What information might I be missing because of my particular position or background? The development of perspective multiplication required conscious effort to seek out and seriously consider viewpoints that challenged one's assumptions. This meant not merely acknowledging that other perspectives existed, but genuinely attempting to understand the reasoning that made those perspectives compelling to their adherents. The goal was not to adopt every alternative viewpoint but to ensure that one's own position resulted from comparing multiple options rather than defaulting to the most convenient or familiar interpretation. These three pillars, skeptical inquiry, emotional archaeology, and perspective multiplication, formed the foundation upon which all other mental defenses could be constructed. Without this foundation, even the most sophisticated defensive techniques would prove ineffective against determined attempts at influence. Machiavelli had learned through painful experience that the mind, like any other valuable asset, required constant vigilance and systematic protection to remain truly free. The practical implementation of these foundational principles demanded daily discipline. Each morning, Machiavelli had developed the habit of reviewing the previous day's decisions and examining them through these three lenses. Had he questioned information sufficiently? Had emotions clouded his judgment? Had he considered alternative perspectives? This reflective practice served not as self-flagellation but as continuous refinement of his mental defenses. As autumn approached and the leaves began their transformation around his estate, Machiavelli felt increasingly confident that he had identified the essential building blocks of mental independence. Yet he also recognized that foundation alone was insufficient. The mind required not only defensive structures but active systems for processing and evaluating the constant stream of information and influence attempts that characterize daily life. The second phase of his investigation would focus on these operational principles. Part 2, The Art of Information Warfare. Winter's arrival brought with it a period of intense correspondence for Machiavelli. Letters arrived regularly from friends and former colleagues in Florence, Rome, and other Italian city-states, each carrying news, requests, and subtle attempts to influence his thinking about various political matters. Despite his exile from formal power, many still sought to sway his opinions, recognizing that his ideas retained influence even without official position. This correspondence provided him with an invaluable laboratory for testing and refining his theories about mental defense. The second phase of mental fortification, he realized, concerned the active management of information flow and the sophisticated evaluation of communication attempts. If the foundation involved preparing the mind's defensive architecture, this phase involved operating those defenses effectively against actual attacks. The principles he developed during this period focused on three critical areas: information diet control, communication analysis, and strategic response protocols. The concept of information diet emerged from Machiavelli's observation that the mind, like the body, was profoundly affected by what it consumed. Just as a steady diet of poor food would weaken physical health, regular consumption of manipulative, biased, or deliberately misleading information would compromise mental clarity and independence. The solution required becoming as selective about information sources as a physician would be about prescribing medicines. This selectivity demanded understanding the difference between information and influence. Pure information presented facts, data, and observations without embedded conclusions or emotional manipulation. Influence attempts, by contrast, combined information with persuasive techniques designed to push the recipient toward predetermined conclusions. The skilled practitioner of mental defense learned to identify influence attempts immediately and extract whatever genuine information they contained while discarding the manipulative elements. Machiavelli developed a systematic approach to evaluating information sources based on their reliability, motivations, and track record. He created mental categories: sources that consistently provided accurate information without obvious agenda, sources that provided accurate information but with clear bias that could be accounted for, sources that mixed accurate information with propaganda, and sources that prioritized manipulation over accuracy. This categorization system allowed him to calibrate his response to information based on its source while avoiding the extremes of blind trust or complete rejection. The practice of information diet control also involved timing considerations. Machiavelli noticed that his mental clarity varied throughout the day, and that consuming complex or potentially manipulative information during periods of reduced alertness increased his susceptibility to influence. He began scheduling his most important reading and correspondence for times when his analytical faculties were sharpest, while relegating routine or clearly biased communications to periods when he felt most mentally resilient. The second operational principle involved sophisticated analysis of communication attempts. Every piece of information, Machiavelli realized, carried multiple layers of meaning beyond its surface content. Skilled communicators embedded their true messages in assumptions, implications, emotional undertones, and strategic omissions. Defending against such sophisticated influence required developing what he called archaeological reading, the ability to excavate these hidden layers and examine them separately from the ostensible message. This archaeological approach involved asking specific questions about every significant communication. What assumptions does this message ask me to accept without examination? What emotional state is it attempting to induce? What information is conspicuously absent? What would I need to believe for this message to seem completely reasonable? Who benefits if I accept this message at face value? What alternative interpretations of the same facts are possible? Machiavelli discovered that manipulative communications often relied on false urgency, artificial scarcity, or appeals to fear and greed. Recognizing these techniques allowed him to respond to the actual content rather than the emotional manipulation. He developed the habit of rewriting important messages in his own words, stripping away persuasive language and emotional appeals to reveal the core factual claims. This practice often revealed how little actual substance lay beneath sophisticated rhetorical techniques. The analysis of omissions proved particularly valuable. Skilled manipulators rarely lied directly, instead, they presented carefully selected truths while omitting crucial context. By systematically asking what information was missing from each communication, Machiavelli often uncovered the real motivations behind apparently straightforward messages. He recalled receiving a letter from a Florentine merchant requesting his support for a particular trade proposal. The letter emphasized the proposal's benefits for the city's economy but omitted mention of how it would specifically benefit the merchant's family business at the expense of competitors. The third operational principle concerned strategic response protocols. Simply recognizing influence attempts was insufficient. Effective mental defense required appropriate responses that maintained independence while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Machiavelli developed a nuanced approach that varied based on the sophistication of the influence attempt, the power dynamics involved, and his own objectives. For crude or obvious manipulation attempts, direct rejection often proved most effective. However, sophisticated influence campaigns required more subtle responses. Machiavelli learned to acknowledge the valuable information in such communications while avoiding commitment to the embedded conclusions. He would respond with questions that demonstrated engagement while revealing his awareness of the manipulation attempt. This approach often led manipulators to abandon their indirect tactics and reveal their true objectives, providing valuable intelligence about their actual motivations and constraints. The development of strategic response protocols also involved timing considerations. Immediate responses to influence attempts often played into the manipulator's strategy, which frequently relied on preventing careful analysis. Machiavelli adopted the practice of delaying responses to important communications, using the interval for thorough analysis and consultation with trusted advisors. When urgency was claimed, he made the delay itself part of his analysis. Genuine emergencies rarely allowed time for elaborate persuasion campaigns. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli discovered that effective response protocols required maintaining multiple options. Influence attempts often succeeded by presenting false dilemmas, situations where only two choices seemed available, both serving the manipulator's interests. By systematically generating alternative responses and seeking creative solutions that served his own objectives, he often found ways to escape such artificial constraints. During this period of intensive correspondence and analysis, Machiavelli also began documenting patterns in the influence attempts he encountered. He noticed that certain techniques appeared repeatedly, suggesting that manipulative strategies followed predictable patterns. Understanding these patterns allowed him to anticipate and prepare defenses against common approaches, much as a military commander might study enemy tactics to develop countermeasures. The seasonal cycle continued its ancient rhythm around his estate as winter deepened into its coldest months.
The enforced isolation provided ideal conditions for developing and testing these operational principles. Each letter became an exercise in practical application of his theories. Each conversation with visitors offered opportunities to observe influence dynamics in real-time interaction.
Gradually, Machiavelli felt his confidence growing not just in his ability to recognize manipulation but in his capacity to navigate complex social and political situations while maintaining his intellectual independence. Yet even as he refined these defensive and operational capabilities, Machiavelli recognized that true mental sovereignty required more than protection against external influence. The most sophisticated practitioners of mental manipulation understood that the most effective attacks came not from outside but from within, by turning the victim's own thoughts and desires against them. The final phase of his investigation would focus on these internal dynamics and the advanced principles required to maintain genuine intellectual freedom. Part 3: The Mastery of Internal Sovereignty. As spring returned to the Tuscan countryside and new life emerged from winter's dormancy, Machiavelli found himself confronting the most challenging aspect of mental independence, the governance of his own internal landscape. The external defenses he had developed during the winter months proved effective against obvious manipulation attempts, but he began to notice more subtle forms of influence that worked by amplifying and redirecting his own natural inclinations. These sophisticated attacks succeeded not by imposing foreign ideas but by hijacking existing thoughts and emotions, making them serve purposes contrary to his genuine interests. The realization came during a correspondence with Francesco Vettori, his friend who still held position in the Medici administration. Vettori's letters contained no obvious manipulation, yet Machiavelli found himself gradually shifting his opinions in directions that served Medici interests rather than his own analytical conclusions. The influence operated through subtle validation of thoughts and feelings that Machiavelli already harbored: his desire for intellectual recognition, his frustration with exile, his pride in his analytical abilities. By carefully reinforcing these natural inclinations while gently steering their direction, Vettori had begun to shape Machiavelli's thinking without triggering any of his defensive mechanisms. This discovery led to the development of what Machiavelli considered his most advanced principles for mental sovereignty. These final techniques address three critical vulnerabilities: the exploitation of personal desires and fears, the manipulation of identity and self-concept, and the subversion of decision-making processes through cognitive biases. Mastering these internal dynamics required not just defensive awareness but active cultivation of psychological disciplines that most individuals never developed. The first advanced principle involved what Machiavelli termed desire archaeology. He had observed that the most effective long-term influence campaigns worked by identifying and gradually reshaping their targets' fundamental desires and aversions. Rather than opposing existing motivations, skilled manipulators would validate and amplify certain desires while diminishing others, slowly altering the target's entire motivational structure. The defense required developing intimate awareness of one's own desire system and monitoring it for unauthorized modifications. Machiavelli began the practice of regular introspective sessions where he would examine his current motivations and compare them to his historical patterns. What did he want now? How had these wants changed over recent months? Could he trace the influences that had shaped these changes? Were his current desires genuinely his own, or had they been subtly cultivated by others with their own agendas? This archaeological process revealed disturbing insights about the malleability of human motivation. Desires that felt entirely natural and personal often proved to have external origins. His current preoccupation with regaining political position, for instance, had been steadily reinforced by correspondents who benefited from keeping him focused on restoration rather than developing independent sources of influence. By maintaining hope for return to formal power, they ensured that his considerable analytical abilities remained oriented toward their interests rather than his own authentic projects. The practice of desire archaeology required distinguishing between authentic personal values and socially imposed wants. Authentic values emerged from deep reflection on fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and the good life. Socially imposed wants, by contrast, were responses to external pressure, social expectations, or manipulative campaigns designed to channel individual energy toward collective purposes. The disciplined practitioner learned to identify and gradually eliminate desires that served others' interests while cultivating motivations that supported genuine personal development. The second advanced principle addressed the manipulation of identity and self-concept. Machiavelli discovered that sophisticated influence campaigns often worked by reshaping how their targets understood themselves, their capabilities, and their proper role in various situations. By subtly altering self-perception, manipulators could control behavior without the target recognizing that external influence was occurring. The person would simply act in accordance with their modified self-understanding, believing they were expressing their authentic nature. This type of influence proved particularly insidious because it felt empowering rather than constraining. The target experienced a sense of clarity about their identity and purpose, not realizing that this clarity had been artificially induced to serve others' objectives. Machiavelli recognized that he had been subjected to such campaigns throughout his career, as various factions had sought to shape his self-understanding in ways that made him more useful to their causes. The defense required developing what he called identity sovereignty, the ability to consciously examine and shape one's own self-concept rather than accepting the identities imposed by social pressure or manipulation. This involved regularly questioning fundamental assumptions about personal characteristics, capabilities, and purposes. Who did he think he was? How had this self-understanding developed? What evidence supported or contradicted various aspects of his identity? Were there alternative self-concepts that might serve him better? Identity sovereignty also required recognizing the difference between role-playing and authentic self-expression. Social situations often demanded particular performances, and skilled social navigation required the ability to play various roles effectively. The danger lay not in role-playing itself but in unconsciously adopting imposed roles as permanent identity. The sovereign individual could engage in necessary social performances while maintaining awareness of their authentic core identity. Machiavelli developed practices for maintaining this awareness, including regular periods of solitude where he could examine his thoughts and feelings without social pressure. He also cultivated relationships with individuals who knew him well enough to provide honest feedback about changes in his behavior or apparent self-concept. These trusted observers could alert him to shifts that might indicate successful identity manipulation. The third and most sophisticated principle involved mastering the biases and systematic errors that characterized human thinking. Machiavelli had observed that even individuals with excellent logical abilities could be manipulated through exploitation of predictable mental shortcuts and emotional patterns. Understanding and correcting for these cognitive vulnerabilities represented the pinnacle of mental sovereignty. The catalog of cognitive biases proved extensive and sobering. Humans naturally sought information that confirmed their existing beliefs while avoiding contradictory evidence. They overestimated the likelihood of recent or memorable events while underestimating gradual changes. They attributed their successes to personal qualities while blaming failures on external circumstances. They preferred simple explanations to complex ones, even when complexity was necessary for accuracy. They made different decisions depending on how options were presented, even when the underlying facts remained identical. Each of these tendencies created opportunities for manipulation by those who understood them. The confirmation bias, for instance, allowed manipulators to gain credibility by initially providing information that validated the target's existing beliefs, then gradually introducing new ideas that seemed to follow logically from the accepted premises. The availability bias enabled influence through selective exposure to dramatic but unrepresentative examples that would disproportionately shape future judgments. Developing defenses against cognitive biases required systematic training in logical analysis and decision-making protocols. Machiavelli began following structured processes for important decisions that included deliberately seeking disconfirming evidence, consulting with individuals who held opposing viewpoints, and examining how different presentations of the same facts affected his intuitive responses. He also developed habits of delayed decision-making for non-urgent matters, using the interval to check for bias-driven reasoning. The practice of cognitive sovereignty also involved understanding the emotional foundations of rational thought. Machiavelli discovered that emotions, rather than opposing rational analysis, actually provided essential information for good decision-making. Fear indicated potential dangers that required attention. Anger suggested boundary violations that needed addressing. Excitement highlighted opportunities worth exploring. The key lay not in suppressing emotional responses but in understanding their proper role in comprehensive analysis. This integration of emotional and rational processing required what Machiavelli called unified consciousness, the ability to access and coordinate all available mental resources rather than allowing them to operate in isolation or opposition. Unified consciousness enabled him to recognize when emotional responses contained valuable information while avoiding emotional decision-making that bypassed necessary rational analysis. As summer approached and the agricultural cycle continued around his estate, Machiavelli felt that he had developed a comprehensive system for maintaining mental independence in a world full of influence attempts. The three phases of development, foundational defenses, operational principles, and internal sovereignty, provided overlapping layers of protection that could resist even sophisticated manipulation campaigns. Yet the true test of these principles lay not in their theoretical elegance but in their practical application to the complex challenges of daily life. The conversations with neighbors, the management of his small estate, the ongoing correspondence with figures throughout Italy, and the gradual development of his literary works all provided opportunities to practice and refine these techniques for mental sovereignty. The irony was not lost on him that his period of greatest political powerlessness had become his time of greatest intellectual freedom. Stripped of official position and the corrupting pressures that accompanied it, he had discovered principles that could protect and enhance mental independence regardless of external circumstances. These insights, he suspected, might prove more valuable than any political office, offering a form of power that could neither be granted nor revoked by external authorities. The principles he had developed during these months of exile and reflection represented more than personal defensive techniques. They constituted a practical philosophy for maintaining human dignity and autonomy in any social system that sought to subordinate individual thinking to collective purposes. Whether the threat came from political propaganda, commercial manipulation, social pressure, or the simple drift of unconscious habit, these principles provided tools for preserving and cultivating the independence of mind that represented humanity's greatest achievement and most precious possession. As Machiavelli walked the familiar paths of his estate in the lengthening days of early summer, he carried with him not bitterness about his exile but satisfaction at having discovered truths that no external authority could confiscate. The mind that had learned to govern itself, he realized, possessed a form of sovereignty that no earthly power could threaten or destroy. In losing his political position, he had found something far more valuable, the knowledge of how to remain forever free.